All right, Mike Lyons is a retired major from the U.S. military. He served in war zones, including Iraq, and he's a well-known commentator on Ukraine. Mike, great to meet you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
You did an interview in December calling for the U.S. to provide the Patriot missile defense system, but you also warned that it's escalatory, and insofar as this could actually turn into, you said, the U.S. firing on a Russian aircraft over Russian territory. That's how dangerous it can be.
Yeah, that's the biggest risk in this conflict right now. The hard border is the Ukraine border as it aligns next to Russia. And the equipment that we've provided fundamentally stays within that sandbox. But if we provide Patriot missiles, you could have a situation where Russian backfire bomber decides to come over the border into Ukraine, drop some kind of payload. A Patriot missile now chases that aircraft back, is going to go hide back in Russia, crosses that border and destroys a Russian aircraft across over Russia. I think Russia will perceive that as an act of war from the United States to Russia, and that's where it becomes escalatory. There's no way for us to bring that missile back. You can't destroy it in air. So I think that's part of the risk of deploying Patriot missiles inside of Ukraine.
And yet, if we don't, Ukraine is going to be destroyed, right? So you take a look at this, just this past weekend, this missile that hit Dnipro, where, now they're saying at least 44 people were killed in that rubble. Mm-hmm. Would the Patriot have stopped that, or there are many missile batteries that will be needed?
Well, yes, a Patriot missile could have stopped that. That's a KH-22. It's launched from the air, but because of its altitude, it can go up to 80,000 feet. And the way it was initially designed was to take out naval carrier groups because of its angle of attack. But the bottom line is Ukraine does not have any kind of forward air system that can detect that kind of missile, but the Patriot missile could. And then it gets back to attack angles. It's a lot of kind of complexities. But the bottom line is all those cities that are close to the Black Sea are under threat because Russia has standoff. They can get 300 miles into the Black Sea, fire that weapon off, and the early detection systems they currently have can't pick up that kind of missile.
How do you judge this winter war? I mean, it seems largely frozen, although Russia has made some advancements on the battlefield. If you take into account that they took Soledar and they are threatening Bakhmut, what do you think is happening, really, if you can cut through some of the haze of the battlefield then?
Well, Soledar and Bakhmut are really not strategic locations, and I think it's Russia trying to gain some kind of victory, some kind of inside morale boost. That you're seeing Wagner groups involved in both of those. They're mercenaries. You've seen them to start to speak out. They don't even believe the cities have been taken. They've both been virtually flattened. World War I type operations that Russia is doing there. But what I see is Russia trying to keep their powder dry in the east in order to do more mobilization eventually in the next 3 months. In some ways, they're just warming up. They have this capability. They don't get rid of their weapon systems ever. It's in their DNA to save these things. There's going to be more equipment that's going to come to the front. I think the Ukraine side doing the same, and they have to be careful not to expend a lot of resources now and decide and pick and choose where they're going to fight. And what I mean by that is it's about an 800-kilometer front there that they're trying to have offensive operations are. And I think that they need to focus more in the south and really use, if they're going to give up forces, they give them up in the east, bring them to the south, because nothing's going to happen on Ukraine's side unless they gain leverage. And that leverage is the potential of the threatening of Crimea. And if they can't do that, then I'm afraid the stalemate's going to continue.
So is Ukraine making a strategic error of sorts? Because initially people said, well, they're nimble. They're able to move fast. They're not like the slow-moving dinosaur, of the Russian army. But in the cases of Bakhmut, especially, and this has been going on for months, and they've just been dug in. The Ukrainians say they're killing a lot of Russians, but I mean, they're also taking losses.
Well, Ukraine had the advantage of the defense on some level, but really they could have prepared more for it. In some places in the south, they were prepared. But what we saw in the beginning of this war, they almost lost Kyiv because they really didn't mobilize like they should have. And they had the advantage of the defense. And that, coupled with Russia has not learned. They've not combined their arms. We thought Russia was going to fight a different way. We thought they were going to combine artillery, air superiority that we thought that they would have by now with ground forces. They just haven't done any of that. They've literally fought this literally almost one combat system at a time, and it's allowed the Ukraine military, plus things like United States intelligence, more accuracy on the fires coming on the side of Ukraine, things that the West has imported into this conflict that have made a difference. But all it's done is just allowed Ukraine to keep the status quo, and it's allowed to keep that border currently that they have in the Donbass region, which was under conflict since 2014 anyway.
I've never heard a good explanation why Russia, with this huge air force, hasn't deployed it very well. Have you got one for me?
Well, because as it turns out, they just don't train to fight combined, and they don't. They thought that this was going to go like Desert Storm did. They thought this was going to be a 3-day war. The allure of battle, everybody wants these things to go very quickly. You look in history, and so many times countries make that mistake. And so I knew that initially that Ukraine had a chance. After the first day, when Russia only fired 200 cruise missiles. Now, if that's the United States, if that's NATO or something, they're firing 2,000, 2,500. They're firing an overwhelming number of cruise missiles in the air to establish that air superiority, going after air defense platforms, going after all those things. Russia didn't do that. And so they fought this, again, very linearly from a combat arms perspective. And the reason why that the Russian Air Force is not dominated is because of the javelins and the Stingers and the things that were in place, and they've threatened the airspace enough. And then you couple that with lack of training and lack of courage on the side of Russia, never combining those armed forces, and the airspace remains uncontested right now. It's open up to anybody who wants to fly.
Mike, how do you read reports that Russia may be preparing a new wave of attacks, possibly coming from the north, from Belarus, and then coming from Russia itself, trying to put the squeeze on Kiev yet again, maybe even as far in the west as Lviv, and trying to cut off incoming supplies from European countries? Some people say it could be weeks away. Some people say, in the next 3 months, you could have a new attack wave ordered by President Putin.
I think we have to be concerned about the north and Belarus. It's a short time of flight, and any kind of indirect fire coming from there, and that country brings in a tremendous real estate advantage. I'm an Army guy, so you look at the ground, right, as to where the advantages that Russia could take advantage from, and that's one of them. It's a different country. It opens up really another front, and Ukraine doesn't have the forces to defend two fronts at this point. That's the sad reality of it, which is why if they get that Patriot battery, it's likely going to Kyiv. It protects the capital. It's their Alamo from a last stand perspective. But they then risk losing Odessa, all those places to the south. Russia controls a fifth of the landmass right now within Ukraine, and it's a highly profitable landmass. There's industrial complexes there, wheat fields. All the things that Ukraine uses to generate revenue is in that space that Russia has, and what they're stealing from right now. I think that if they do that, they open up those fronts. They're mobilizing more troops. They have more capacity. The question is whether the West brings in the offensive weapons, the tanks coming from potentially England, the United States. We're sending Brads in now. The question is when can they get there, and can they get there on time?
Do you think the Bradleys will change the battlefield? There's 50 of them.
Yeah, again, hard to say that would tip the balance completely in the favor. It might tip a battle in the favor of Ukraine. And again, if they could, the optimal situation for Ukraine, I think, is to get 20 to 30,000 Russian soldiers to surrender. Let's say they cut off, they do a divide and conquer in the south there. If you look on a map, on or around, not even as far east as Mariupol, but in Kramatorsk and some of those areas there, if they can kind of divide Russian forces, surround them, get a large number, 20,000 Russians to surrender, I think that would be a strategic goal for the Ukraine military that could really tip the balance back. Gives them leverage. If they want the fighting to stop, Ukraine's got to have some leverage in order to get Russia to stop. Right now, they still don't have that.
Major, what do you think about this debate about the Leopard tanks? I mean, Britain has come forward with 14 Challenger 2 tanks. That's not a lot, but
right.
It's thought that will pave the road to put pressure on Germany. You have this meeting in Ramstein of defense ministers from about 50 countries. Countries like Poland, as you've noted, I've watched you on the air on CNN this week, saying that, Poland, yes, they're willing to give their Leopard tanks to Ukraine, right, but there are export controls on those weapons. Germany has to sign off on them. They're the ones that produce the tanks. does this debate matter that much if they're able to get that kind of armor into Ukraine? And do you think Germany will have to give ground in the end?
Well, Ukraine's running out of time. It's as simple as that. They have to get crews trained. This is not a, a video game where they could just kind of add them to there and add water and get them to that spot. Crews have to be trained. They're different weapon systems. Frankly, the dirty little secret about those German tanks in Germany, they're probably not working very well. The Germans have completely neglected their defense forces for the past 10 or 15 years and completely relied on NATO. Unfortunately, we've let them do that. And again, the Challenger tanks, great, but 14 doesn't make a difference. A U.S. armored division has 360 main battle tanks in it. They need division worth of equipment. They need, hundreds of main battle tanks. And to get them there is going to take time. It's going to take a rail system. They can't, when the United States fights these wars, we use boats, we use rail, we use all kinds of ways to get those tanks there. They're pre-positioned in pumpkin stocks. None of that stuff is there online right now. What they could hope for is to get the old Soviet equipment that sits in some of those NATO countries that were formerly part of the Warsaw Pact and possibly deploy those. But now they're lower grade. They're still armored vehicles. They provide crew protection. They'll give the crew members confidence. But again, Russia could eventually bring more of that kind of crappy, frankly, military equipment to the battlefield.
So you're saying even if you were tomorrow, somebody, push the button in Berlin to give these weapons to Ukraine, considering the crews that need to maintain them, the equipment that has to get to them, the training of Ukrainians. I mean, we're not talking about a couple of months. I mean, you're talking about 6 months or a year.
Yeah, the first tank maybe shows up in 90 days, and that assumes that you have a crew to put in on it. And they're not being trained. You'd have to, we're training some of the Patriot missile battery crews back at Fort Sill now. That training normally takes a year to 18 months. We're going to try to do it in 30 to 40 days. I don't know. They're going to make mistakes on that weapon platform. They might shoot down Ukraine helicopters. I mean, that's a complex weapon system with integrated radar and air defense capability that takes a while to get used to develop the instincts that you need when you're in combat to know that you're firing friend or foe. But the time is, again, not on their side. We'd have to start today. We'd have to start bringing those tanks to Poland, getting them there and getting them pre-positioned, and then figuring out how they're going to get them to the front. And again, time is not on the side of Ukraine.
All right, last question to you, and that would be, I spent a lot of time as a correspondent in Russia, and we used to pass by some of these so-called secret cities that didn't even have names on them, and that's where they produced weapons. There is a huge assembly line in Russia, which I don't think people fathom how big it was. I mean, this was a weapon-producing state. It was the main thing that they produced, and President Putin is out there irrigating, fertilizing that again, and tried to bring all that production back. He won't bring it all back, but he'll bring some of it back. Sure. So if you were to look through the haze of some of the very positive pictures that are painted about Ukraine and people talking about victory, and mix that with the reality really of what they're facing in terms of numbers, and President Putin's willingness just to keep this going, there are some pretty hard realities on the battlefield. Do you think that any victory is in sight, or that Ukraine, in fact, is still in very, very deep danger and they could lose this war?
Yeah, they're in trouble. I mean, they kind of win right now by not losing on a day-to-day perspective, but strategically, Russia's 4 times everything over Ukraine, 10 times when it comes to the military capability from the industrial capacity that Russia has, 4x in terms of the amount of people they could throw at this, the amount of people that have already left Ukraine. They're just running out of people. They're running out of bodies in order to try to fight. We all understand what's at stake here, but it's in Russia's DNA not to stop. They just don't. I don't see them stopping anytime soon, and they just could be warming up. And the West has got to recognize that. When I talk to people at the Pentagon, they like the fact that the Russian military is being destroyed in place by Ukraine. So there's no question Ukraine is doing a big favor to the West, and I think there's going to be a calculation when they figure out that Russia's conventional forces really can't threaten Europe anymore, and then maybe the offensive weapons go, and then maybe there's the leverage in order for them to stop. But there's a couple of things that Russia's not giving up. One of them is Crimea. they're not giving up Sevastopol. They're not giving up the Black Sea Fleet. That's where it's their only warm water port that they have. So at some point, there's going to be something to be said for that. And then the question is whether or not those other areas that are in the Donbass region, high industrial complexes, whether Russia ends up taking them over, what the people want to do there, and the like. But Ukraine is going to have to accept some level of negotiation if they want the artillery to stop and if they want to survive and keep going.
Ukraine says they won't, but I guess everybody says that in conflict, don't they? In the midst of it, there's a long road ahead and a lot of suffering to be had.
Both sides' strategic objectives are not aligned. The Ukraine strategic objective is to get Russia out of all of Ukraine. They don't have the ways and the means to do that. Russia's strategic objective is to take all of Ukraine, Kyiv, take it all the way to their westernmost border. They don't have the military mission, and they don't have the ways and means to do that. Until one side figures out they've got to change those strategic objectives, you're going to see the stalemate continue.
Major Mike Lyons, great to talk to you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dana. Thanks so much for having me.